Okay, and a good morning to everyone. We do a formal good morning to welcome those of you who are watching on television, those of you who are with 3C Media Solutions out of Palomar. And we were just listening to Rod Stewart and Maggie May, a classic, probably of classics. You had an assignment yesterday in which I expected you to go over to Sierra Hall 221 and get some data. Now, the data involved countries from the World Factbook 2008. Will you take out that information, please? This is going to become part of Lab 1. I'm basically changing the directions in Lab 1. We're going to do the lab from the perspective of this information. Now, let me clarify a little bit more about World Factbook 2008. We talked about it yesterday, and I guess before I go further, I should remind people who just tuned in that this is a STAT course, and so it's elementary statistics, and we are coming to you from Modesto Junior College. This is a live broadcast and a very full room of students, and I'm Dr. Curl. We'll be with you the entire semester if you choose to watch us, and hope that you enjoy the material on statistics. Our focus is the World Factbook 2008, done by the CIA. And as you saw, as you looked at the World Factbook 2008, there are a number of variables that are involved. And I tried to present that yesterday so you could see what kind of variables we focus on during this semester. When that information was provided in the summer, as is typically done, we need to take it from the World Factbook. And that is not a matter of triviality. You look at all that information and then you have to record it. And so you enter data into a spreadsheet in essence. Now Stat Graphics provides a form of a spreadsheet. And so one of the concerns we have is whether there are any data entry errors. Now when you enter data, as you did last night or this morning or yesterday, whenever you did it, you write down numbers, correct? And one of the big concerns you have is if you read the number correctly, did you invert digits? Is it really the data that you thought you were writing down? So there should be an audit if you're going to enter data, and it's very serious. And the project we have is a very serious project because there are very few sources of the information from the World Factbook that are archived. We are one of those archives. And so we make a very conscientious effort to audit those entries. So in summer session, I had students selecting 10 countries at a time, and we went through the entire database. Students had to take the database, create what you just did for the 10 countries they had, and then they had to compare those figures to what we had online. Otherwise, they went to the World Factbook, got their information from there, and then compared against what you saw as World Factbook 2008 that was created for you. That's called an audit. And we found some mistakes. It's pretty darn clean at this point. Now that exercise for them was valid, real, nothing contrived. They were basically providing the audit to guarantee that we have a clean database for 2008. We've done that each year. We put those databases online. Now, I wanted an activity of similar importance to you, but I didn't want it contrived. Otherwise, the audit's been done, so it doesn't make sense to have you do an audit for something that was done. It would no longer be realistic. So asking you to select a sample. Now that means you didn't take all 208, you're taking 10 countries out of 220 some. So you have about 10% of the population represented. Now it was stratified to the extent that I ask you to get countries from each continent. It is proportionally stratified because if you have 20% of your countries in Europe, I ask for 20% of your sample to be from Europe. So we refer to that as a proportional stratified sample. Ideally, if you wanted 2 countries from Europe, I would have had you make a list of the number of countries in Europe and maybe cut them out, fold them in little pieces, put them in a paper bag, shake it up, reach in and draw a country out of there and say, that's my random selection. If we had done that, we would say that you had a random, stratified, proportional sample. So stratified, proportional, random sample would be the ideal. We didn't do randomness. Okay, so for that, we would be criticized. And I ask you to try to find what you thought might be a representative country from Europe. Now, for example, if you were to take Africa and try to find a representative country, you would need to look at many of the countries in Africa and say, what's in common about those countries in Africa? Then pick one that you think is representative. But see, you have bias introduced at that point. So in spite of the bias that's potential in what you did, the exercise is going to provide us an opportunity to do what I want to do to make this assignment meaningful. Some of the observations are going to involve different variables. So I'm going to ask you as individuals, because I have different seating patterns here, so I'm going to take the first group and make an assignment for you, then the next group an assignment, the next table an assignment, the next table an assignment, and then anybody not at the table is an assignment. So each of you will have a different assignment, but you're going to essentially reach some of the same conclusions. Now, one of the fascinations that I have with this process, because we've been looking at the World Factbook since 1994 in the classes I've had, and the observations are independent of the year. Just let that sink in for a moment. If I go back and look at 1994, the observations that I'm going to ask you to consider this morning are going to be as valid in 2008 as they were in 1994. For the people who are doing the video-based course and choose to go with the 2004 lectures and reference the 2003 database, they reach the same observations you do. Now, there are some changes. We talk about aha moments. One of those things where you sort of go, wow, didn't expect that. 1994, this was before the CIA World Factbook was available on a graphical interface, what they call a graphical user interface, a GUI, a GUI. I was referencing the Britannica, and you will find the reference in the world data files to that Britannica database. The yearbook, the annual yearbook for the Encyclopedia Britannica listed much of what you were seeing in the CIA database. And I was going through, hour after hour, getting the information for the 220 plus countries. And I was looking at birth rates. And the lowest birth rate I hit was one of those jaw-dropping moments. It was Italy. The lowest birth rate in 1994 was Italy. And the first thing that went through my head was, no. Rome? Vatican? Principal position of the Catholic Church is anti-birth control. Why would Italy, of all places, have the lowest birth rate in the world? It just, one of those moments that didn't compute in my head. And it was a reality. The lowest birth rate now typically is not Italy. We'll see it bouncing back and forth. And I don't know if you happen to see what the lowest birth rate is in terms of what you have on your 10 countries. Will you look at your birth rates now? And does anybody have a birth rate under 10? Okay, I've got several people raising their hands. Okay, what was your country? Okay, Germany, and what was the rate?
8.18.
8.18. Now, Germany is one of the low ones. Okay? And, of course, Germany has a problem. They have negative population growth. They are losing people. Okay? As many countries in Europe are. Okay, another one. Who has... Okay, yes. Japan, and what was its low?
7.87.
7.87, below the 8. Okay? Who else? Anybody have one that can lowball the 7.87? Okay. Let me give you another figure. I think this is going to be the one I want to look at. Okay, if I look at Hong Kong, 7.37. Folks, that's low. Okay, 7.37 per thousand population. Okay. So the low figure, Italy at that time in 1994, I believe, was at the 9-something. So it's dropped below the 9, and we're down into the 7s. I don't believe we have reached below 7 that I can recall. Okay, now what was the high birth rate on your list? Just try to pick out a high one on your list. Who has something they can share? Okay?
Nigeria was 39.98.
39.98 for Nigeria. Anybody else?
Malawi, 41.79.
Okay, Malawi at 41.79. 79? Okay.
Mali, 49.38.
Mali at 49.38. Anybody top that? Okay, let me go for another one. I have privileged information. We looked at this summer. And the one I'm going to give you is a consistent value for years. That's what I'm saying. Some things change and yet don't change. Niger, 49.62. At one point was in the 50 range. Okay? So you've got Hong Kong down in the 7 range and Niger in the near 50. That's a huge contrast. So as we look at information, numbers tell us a story. Now, I was rather fascinated because yesterday a young lady came into the office area and was asking about taking a course in mathematics, already had her BA, and wanted to take a course in the sciences. We don't usually consider our institution postgraduate, but it was a fascinating discussion. And her major was remote sensing. Now, I want to see if you are more knowledgeable than I was, because I said, what? Remote sensing. Anybody know what we're talking about? Oh, you make me feel better.
Censorship somewhere? Far away?
Yeah, you'd think so. Well, far away, good, remote, but it was geography. We have satellites providing images, and so you look at coral reefs, and you have satellite imaging, and so you can compare an image of 10 years ago to an image right now and do what? Determine if the coral reefs are getting smaller. You can look at the ice flows. You can look at the Arctic Circle. You can look at the glaciers. And by looking at comparative images, tell what? The impact, if you will, of climate change. The euphemistic better choice than global warming. Okay? We are looking at numbers in the same way as remote sensing. When you look at Hong Kong with a 737 birth rate and you look at Niger with a 49.62, don't you immediately have some contrast in your mind about the number of children and the populations that might be involved? You would expect with a 49.62 that maybe that population is growing faster than a country with a 737. Make sense? Now, the Cairo Conference and the program of action, I said to you yesterday, involved a program of action. And there's a link to that program of action as you look at the links on the web page. And if you look at that program of action, I said it involved empowerment of women, essentially allowing women to make judgments about their reproductive lives without it being determined by culture or society or a paternalistic approach where the man's going to determine what happens in that home. Okay? But what else drives high birth rates? Give some thought to that for a moment. What would you argue is a cause and effect kind of relationship for high birth rates? And consider the variables that you have on your paper. What now? But we don't have death rates on our paper, okay? Another one. Infant mortality. If you're going to lose 50% of your children, then you might have more than one. What was the lament this summer, just prior to the Olympics in China? Sichuan province. What were they angry about? Okay, the schools collapsed in the earthquake. The children died. Now, the argument was the government had not been proactive enough in providing for a good construction, and so when the earthquake hit, the schools tended to suffer the greatest. So children died. And what is the policy in China regarding the number of children a family is supposed to have? One child. Now, by the way, the government, in a kind of empathetic response, is saying, you can now have another one to replace the one you lost. I don't know how conciliatory that is viewed or how realistic it's going to be. But if you knew that you were going to lose half your children, you'd have more than one. So if you are going to have high infant mortality, it's most likely you're going to have more children. What else will drive it? Yes?
Male and female literacy.
Literacy. If you know about a number of things, I'm trying to see how I want to couch this. Everything from birth control to the implications economically to having a great number of children and the potential difficulties. If you have a literacy, you might be inclined to make decisions differently than if you knew nothing. So female literacy and male literacy. What else? Keep looking at those variables. Yes, GDP. Because if you don't have much money, in many of these countries, remember we looked at a country with a gross domestic product, which translated into roughly an annual salary of $1,000 a year, and that's not the low one. You have to have some way of surviving. So for many economies that are not industrially based, what does that involve?
Farming.
Yes, farming. And you can't hire the help, so you grow the help. Okay, go back to the Midwest, the United States, 100 years ago. Families were 10 and 11 children, and all the children helped on the farm. And that's how you survived. Okay? So big families, you fed them off the garden and the plants and the, it wasn't a case of it's going to take $40,000 to put this child through college. It's rather daunting if you have 5 children right now and plan to put them all through college, and you can get by pretty well in California in the community college, but you get in some states it's as expensive at a community college as at a university nearly. And so the figures, if you transfer, what are you looking at? Transfer costs to live away from home at a university, a public university in the state of California. What are your fees going to be? And what are your living expenses going to be? Would it be reasonable? I'm asking it nearly rhetorically because it appears you haven't looked ahead, but maybe at least $20,000? Some of the fees are going to be $2,000 to $4,000 in public institutions just for tuition. Add another grand on for books, and then you got to live, and finding an apartment under $400 is pretty tough, so add on a few more thousand, and then gas at $4 a gallon. It gets expensive. So if you're going to pay for that for your children, you have 5 children, you're looking minimally at a $100,000 outgo. Makes you think twice if you're going to have 5 kids or not. Okay? Or you hope you're going to have them all work and pay their own way. Then you don't have to worry about it. But those are guiding processes through the gross domestic product. Anything else that you see in that list? We talked about literacy. We talked about infant mortality. We talked about gross domestic product. Anything else you see there that might contribute? AIDS would be an issue in countries where we have life expectancies down in the 30 range, and children are going to many times face a very tough go. It's rather interesting. If the parents are dying young, then they don't have a chance for very many children, so the birth rate goes down. Somewhat of a cause and effect, some of those relationships. And so my point being, as you look at what you're seeing in this data, you're going to see relationships, and that is what is going to be involved in your first lab. So, the group up here, in this first U in front of me, I want you to focus on birth rates for the 10 countries you have. And I want you to do a compare and contrast based on the 10 countries you have. So you're going to write out minimally a long paragraph. And that's due tomorrow. Typewritten with a word processor. Compare and contrast what you find about birth rates. And I want you to, once you've done that, so you've isolated on birth rate, that's your compare and contrast. Then in your next paragraph, I want you to see the relationship between the birth rate, the life expectancy female, infant mortality, and gross domestic product. So the first group is going to take birth rate and then going to compare female literacy, infant mortality, and gross domestic product. Otherwise, I want you to try to see some relationship there. High versus low. As the rain comes down, if we think of the Midwest this past year, as the rain came down, what went up? The floods went up. As the price of oil went up, so went up the price at the pump. What kind of associations do you see in those variables? Okay, next group. This is the next row. Okay, this row, I want you to focus on female literacy as your first observation. Female and male literacy combo. Compare and contrast. Female and male literacy. Then, I want you, once you've done that paragraph, to focus on birth rate, infant mortality, and GDP. Next group. This is the third benchmark coming back. I want your focus to be on population growth. Okay. Again, you're looking by continent. So the contrast is by continent for all of you. So you're looking at compare and contrast by continent, and I want the third group to focus on population growth. And for you, I'd like you, once you've done that, your second paragraph is going to be related to, okay, just a moment, population growth. I want birth rate, gross domestic product, and I'm very tempted to throw in AIDS. What's part of the problem with AIDS? We don't have a lot of data. If you saw the information, sometimes it's just less than 0.1% and oftentimes missing. So let's take net migration for you. Those are your three variables that you're doing for associations. So the third group was population growth as your focus by continent. Then you want birth rate, gross domestic product, and net migration. Net migration is a rather interesting kind of problem because there are times you would expect net migration to be what? Otherwise, people leaving the area versus coming in. So if net migration, that's coming in, you'd expect people to be leaving an area. So what has happened in Iran in the last 5 years? Besides the fact that we have been in a war, what's happened to the population in Iran? Who's left? I don't mean who's still there. Who left the country? Seriously, no answer in that. Basically, the middle and upper class have left the country. And they've gone where? Well, no, we have not been very open to that. Where have they gone? Who's close to Iran? Syria. Okay, and another country, I believe is Sweden. And it's become a problem. Sweden, I believe it was Sweden. Sweden or Switzerland, one of the two, has taken the attitude that we will try to be open and take as anybody, a little bit like our statement on the Statue of Liberty. We take your huddled masses and so on from Europe. And they finally had to sort of close the door. But I'll give you a figure for Iran. Because, interesting, sometimes numbers are not what you might think. And by the way, what I find I have to do is take a ruler coming across, trying to read these, because it is sometimes easy to just go down one column or one, bounce up or down. The net migration for Iran, it tells the story, negative 3.2. And that's indeed what's happened. Now, by the way, that's starting to reverse with the stability. Okay, Afghanistan. What about Afghanistan? We've been in a war there too, right? The Russians were in a war before us with them. The Taliban. You would expect maybe because of the harsh conditions, people would do what? Leave Afghanistan. Yes? Okay, so Afghanistan. Are the numbers what we would expect? Afghanistan net migration, a positive 21. Not what I anticipated. Iran, the numbers are where you'd expect. But with Afghanistan, like people are coming in, why? Give me an answer why they're coming into Afghanistan. Suggestion. Watch the news and read the paper. And become aware. Even if it's Stephen Colbert. Okay? It's humorous, but at least you learn something of what's going on. And if you drive in, listen to NPR for a half hour or 10 minutes. There's information there. Ay, ay, ay. Well, what's from Pakistan to Afghanistan, because there's a border and there is free movement across that border, and where did people go who are being, well, it's in terms of the, it's related to the war, but if you are a person who would be opposed to the United States, a good place to go is to Afghanistan, because it's a country in which very porous border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and there are a lot of people who are coming from Syria, coming from Iran, trying to support the cause against U.S. occupation in Afghanistan. And of course, I hope you're aware that this thing is very volatile, because what happened just in Pakistan last week? The president basically resigned because he was going to be impeached, and the government is very unstable, and that has been, to some extent, a very critical part of what's going on in that area, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. These issues are part of your life, folks. And some of the things we see as we look at this give you some insights into what's going on in those countries. Okay, next group. This goes to the back row and those sitting back by the door. Okay, I've got to look at what I've focused on so far. I need to get my page back so I can look what I've written down. Okay, I had birth rate for the first group, female literacy, male literacy for the second, population growth for the third. And for that next group, I'd like you to focus on infant mortality among the continents. So infant mortality is going to be your focus by continent. And then, of course, I'd like you to see the relationship between birth rate, and I'd like to look at female literacy and gross domestic product, because those three, you should find some relationships in there. And again, the question, and we're going to address this as we go into about the third week. We're going to look at what we call bivariate data. Now, if you think of your algebra background, you know how to graph a line. Slope-intercept, y equals mx plus b. If that's not communicating whatsoever, you might want to review. Okay, so you have two variables, x and y. You can get a line, and y equals mx plus b is the equation of the line. Now, if I look at ordered pairs, so for example, I take the infant mortality and the birth rate. You have 10 ordered pairs. And you were to plot those. You should see some association, is my guess. And you'd hope that those points you're plotting are going to fit in a line. And then you're going to try to generate the equation of the line and be able to estimate birth rate knowing the infant mortality. That's called bivariate data analysis, and we spend a whole week to 2 weeks in that concept. Okay? So it's that kind of association we're looking at. Now, the question of cause and effect. Is the infant mortality influencing birth rate? We just commented that there's a good argument for that. Okay? So one would be an independent variable, the other a dependent variable. So x, the independent variable, y, the dependent variable. So if x is infant mortality, you're arguing that if that's high, you're going to see a high birth rate. That's the kind of association you're looking for, and try to defend it. So in these associations, you're going to contrast pairs of numbers and see what you can say. And you have a full paragraph in that, as opposed to the first paragraph, which is, by continent, are you noticing anything? Give you a hint for those of you who are focusing on population growth. Really look at Europe. Okay? If you're doing population growth, that was that third group. Europe's going to be a big one, depending on if the two countries you picked were representative. You may not see it with just two countries. Okay, everybody else who's on the floor. Okay, next one. I had 5 picked out. So the next one. Okay, I focused on birth rates. We focused on that. We focused on, I just have to see what's left. Population growth. Total fertility rate. So total fertility rate is the next one. So somebody on the floor, somebody had to leave because they had a meeting to go to. There's a desk open. So if you don't want to be on the floor, but if you're on the floor, you get this one. Okay, this is total fertility rate. That by continent. Okay. And again, what was total fertility rate? Number of children a woman would expect to have during her lifetime. Okay? And by continent. And then what would you think you'd want to relate that to? Birth rate, female literacy, and GDP. Got it? And I want a page. One paragraph for each, and I don't want a one-line paragraph. Okay, paragraphs ostensibly include 3 or 4 lines, sentences, and you would like to illustrate, if possible, with some countries illustrating your point. Have we got it? Done with the word processor, and this is due tomorrow. Now you're going to combine this output you wrote down and your page, that's going to be part of your first lab. So we're parsing it out. In addition to that, I want you to read the intro to Lab 1 in the World Population in Crisis. Now, there's about 7 pages there. And I want you to write out a summary, 1 full page, single-spaced, minimally, not too much more than that, of those 7 pages. So a summary. Okay? Finally, I want you to print out from the World Factbook 2008 the entire database so that all the columns are on 1 page. You're going to have about 5 pages. Let me show you what that's going to look like. Now, you're going to need some help, perhaps, to the extent that you need to know how you can minimize the width of a column. So let me just illustrate what I've done here so you can get an idea. Now, this is coming across as we look at the document cam. This is just a list of my countries, and I'm in the 100 range. And as I come across, notice how, as I come across, right here, some of the columns are pretty tight. The space between them are pretty small. And I come all the way across, and the last thing I see up here is the AIDS figure. You don't need to have the country listed. I have another column for the countries in the World Population 2008. So you're going to have to control font size, and I'll hold this up so you can just see the page without on the document cam. You can get an idea of what it looks like. Okay. Now, to that extent, I've got a fairly small font. Do it on what we call landscape, and let me give you a figure to shoot for, because I don't want this where you have to do it with a magnifying glass. Okay, so I have 52 countries per page. So you're going to have to control your output, and I'd like that part of your lab. So you're going to have a title page, Lab 1, Opening Data Files. That's what it's called. And that title page is going to include your name, the date, my name, okay, so that because other people are doing labs, and sometimes labs get misplaced as they come under my door when they're due. And so I want your name, my name, the date, the lab name, and the lab number on the front page, title page, in a font large enough I can read it. And of course, the fact that it's a Math 134, the class helps too. It tells you in Lab 1, in the directions for that lab, what you should have as part of the title page. Now, the handwritten copy you have is what you're going to submit that you just did last night. That'll be a part of that lab. So don't just rip it out, undo the staple so it looks decent, and submit that with your lab. Your page you're going to print out for me, which is your compare and contrast by continent, and then other variables will be part of that presentation, and then you will have 1 page, which is the summary of the intro to the lab. Now, this is different than the directions in the lab. But you're going to find some relationships, and we're going to talk about those relationships tomorrow. Any question? Yes?
Then do we submit the lab to here tomorrow, or do we
No,
start?
you will have an opportunity to work on that and submit it on Thursday. Your labs are due Thursday. If you're in a video base, they get to do by Friday. But for you, since you're on campus and the campus is basically closed for most of you by Thursday, there's no point in coming back for Friday. So it's due on Thursday. And just a reminder, I do not accept late labs. Okay? And I'll be grading that on a 10-point scale. Yes?
You just want them stapled, or you want them actually like?
No, I'd like it stapled because when I get 80-some labs and I write my comments on it, it works just best to have it stapled, but they should be done neatly. Use a spell checker on what you write, okay, and complete sentences. And if it starts looking too much of a mess, then I start taking points off. Yes?
The compare and contrast page, that's due tomorrow, though?
Yes, I want to have that done tomorrow so we can talk about it. In fact, I'm not going to collect what I ask you to do today. We've talked about it. In the same way tomorrow, I want it done so we can discuss it and see what kinds of things you saw, because, again, we're looking at statistics as a window into the world. And the world in this case is the entire world as a database. To that extent, we're just looking at numbers. We've not tried to describe beyond that. We haven't looked at averages. We haven't looked at graphs. Now, I did show you a pie chart yesterday that gave you a sense of why we wanted 2 countries from Europe. We looked at a pie chart. We will be focusing on both numerical and graphic descriptions. That'll be our focus, and then we're going to go beyond that and we're going to do what's called inference or inferential statistics. So, for example, if you took your 10 countries and you just looked at birth rates and you found the average of those 10 birth rates, my guess is you're going to get a value somewhere in the 20s, low 20s. Now, I showed you yesterday that if we go back a decade, we'd be in the 28, 29 range. So let's say that you found some information reported in a research article that said the average birth rate globally, births per thousand, is going to be 29. You take your sample of 10 countries, ideally a random sample, not the biased one you chose, and not that you had any particular bias, but it wasn't random. But if we took those 10 countries and looked at your average birth rate, and let's say it's 22, you would say on the basis of your sample that you challenge the accepted view that it's 29. In fact, you're going to reject that statement. And on the basis of your sample, you reject a statement about the population figure. Now, I don't mean population like how many countries in the world, but the population of data for 200 and some countries in the world. That's what's done in research. And that's what we focus on in the last 2/3 of the course. Any other questions on this assignment? Okay. Looking at your 10 countries, looking at your birth rate, okay? I hope you have a calculator at this point. And if you do, take it out. The calculator I would like you to have is the 531 EL Sharp calculator. But any calculator at the moment will do. So if you have a calculator, take it out and add those first 10 birth rates. And then in your head, divide by 10 if you need to, move the decimal one place to the left. I'd like to know the average birth rate for the 10 countries you have. If you don't have a calculator, 10 countries, you can do it by hand. Add the 10 numbers. By hand, if no calculator. It's not unrealistic. So get me the sum of your first 10 countries. Okay, so this is finding the average for your 10 countries. That's where I'd like to start this morning for a moment with what we call an average. So we're just taking some information, add the 10 numbers, and divide by 10. Then we're going to write some numbers on the board. We'll take some time to do that, but as you get numbers, will you share them, please? So you have a value for me? 20.329. Would you mind if I just round off to the nearest tenth, just for convenience sake? Somebody else? 19 point?
19.
Just 19?
No, 19.19.
Oh, redundant? So 19.2 to the nearest tenth. Okay, anybody else? 19.5. Somebody else?
19.6.
19.6. Somebody else? 20.1. This is going better than I thought. About the time I say it's going better than I thought, somebody throws in a ringer. 17.3, okay? 23.82, so I'll go 23.8. Anybody else? Come on, we got more people in here than that. 24.8?
24 point, you round up to 5.
25,
24.5.
24.5, thank you. Next,
1.7.
what is it?
21.7.
21.7, okay? 18.7, keep coming. 20.9. Okay, I heard a 19 from two different people. One of them was a 0.5 and one was a 0.4. Is that correct? Okay. Next. 15.9. Oh, boy. Anybody else? Yes. 18.12. 18.1. Who else? Come on. I got more people in here than this. Yes. 21.4. Waiting. Even if you're doing it by hand, it shouldn't take too long. Anybody else? And you divide by 10, just moving the decimal. Yes. 19.5. Notice I'm rounding off to the nearest tenth. That's the arithmetic I'm doing. Anybody else? 17.5. Keep coming. We're waiting. How many we got up there? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18. Come on, folks. That's just a little more than half. Anybody else? That means some of you didn't do the work. Aha! Not happy to hear that. My comment was, if you look at all 200 plus countries, it should be about what? 21. That was the argument. Now, the symbol I'm going to use for a population is a Greek symbol. It's the Greek symbol mu. Tweak just a bit, Jennifer. Thank you. And these values are going to be used with an English symbol called X bar. And we call this the mean. So we have a sample mean and a population mean. The sample means are an estimate of the population mean. So how many of these were good estimates as you look at them? The 20.3 is pretty good. The 23.8 seems a bit high. So this looks a little bit high. This certainly looks what? Low. But let me ask you this. For the person who has 15.9, that was yours? Okay, countries. What were your values for Africa that you chose?
Egypt, Botswana, those were the only two.
Egypt and Botswana. What were their birth rates?
Egypt was actually 22.12.
Ah, okay.
22.96.
You have two countries in Africa with birth rates in the 20s. If you were to look at the database and go through Africa and hunt for representative countries, you'd probably look for 30s and 40s. Because most of Africa is characterized by what? Higher birth rates. And so, because you ended up getting some low ones in Europe, who did you choose? What were those two birth rates?
9.54 and 9.87.
Okay, so you ended up lowballing a couple important values and ended up with a very low figure. And so I'm going to use a criterion here that may or may not communicate. My age will start showing here. Sesame Street? How many of you know about Sesame Street? Raise your hands. Well, you make me feel a little bit better. Okay, Sesame Street, a child's program, but there was a thing that they did for children. They compared things and said, one of these doesn't look like the other. Which one is it? That's a Sesame Street criterion. So I've got some things. They look pretty much the same, but one of them's different. Can you find it? And for children, sometimes that's a difficult thing. Okay? Well, this one looks a lot different than the others, correct? And there's a reason for it, that it wasn't as representative as we'd like. Now, that doesn't mean bias-wise that you were looking for low values. You just happen to focus on Egypt and Botswana. They seem like pretty decent. But if you'd chosen Niger and Mali, it'd have been a different story. Okay, let's go to the 23.8. Who had the 23.8? Okay, country-wise, when you did Africa, what two values did you have?
Tanzania and Mali.
Okay, you got Mali in that. And Tanzania was what? How high were they?
35 points.
Okay, the 35s. When for Europe, who did you end up with?
Europe, I did Finland, I did one.
Ah, okay, rather than two.
Yeah, I did one.
Okay, for North America or somebody else, you had to take a couple.
I did North America, too.
Okay, who did you choose for North America?
Belize and Montserrat.
And what kind of numbers did you have there?
27.84 and 17.33.
Okay, that 27 is increasing. I can't, just listening to the numbers you selected of the four you shared, I can't see why that's so darn high, but it is somewhat high. Okay? Okay, it just happened by chance that they came out high. Okay? Any others of these that you would question as being unreasonable? There's one more. That 24.5. Okay, who had that? Okay, who did you end up with Africa?
Mali too.
Mali, okay.
And
Who else?
Togo.
Togo?
Mhm.
Okay, and what were the numbers for Togo?
For the birth rate, or
Yeah, birth rate.
it was 36.6.
Okay, that's a pretty high number. And for Europe, who did you end up with?
Bulgaria and Croatia.
Okay, and those I would expect to be fairly low numbers.
Yeah, they're only 9.
Yeah, okay, so where did you pick up the other high ones?
Oh, Yemen is 42.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah.
And another
then
one
Mali,
has...
those are the two really big ones. There
Okay.
was Samoa was 28.2.
Okay, so you ended up by choice with some values that are pretty high. Now, we are going to look later, and this is a very important concept I'm going to talk about right now. We have 200 and, let me give you the figure. I need to go to the last page. I believe it's 220, well, I'm looking at 225, but I have a blank line I see. So it's around 224, 223 I see, 222. Looks like we may have about 221 countries, is going to be my guess. So 221 countries that we'll have in the database. Now, if we look at that, and I take samples of size 10, do you remember a thing out of intermediate algebra called combinatorials? Combinations? You're supposed to all be doing this. Yes, I remember. Combinations. If you have 5 things, doing them 3 at a time, C5, 3. Now you have 2 things to look at tonight, slope intercept and combinations. But I want C22110. Can be done in your calculator. That is a huge number. We have that many possible samples we could do. Now, I had somewhere around 20, correct? Roughly 20. Does anybody have this number from your calculator? Those with the TI 83, 84, etc., well, you should be able to whip this out in a heartbeat. You can do it on the EL 531. It's just a little bit harder to do. Anybody have a number for this yet? 6.22 what? Times 10 to the 16th power. You don't look impressed. If I told you that was your paycheck and you had that kind of look, okay, there's a 6 with a decimal point with how many zeros after it? 16 zeros. So let me just say we have a 60, then 5 groups of 3. One, two, three, four, 5. And so let's name that number. Thousands, millions, billions, trillions, quadrillion, 60 quadrillion. Now that's bigger than our national debt, just barely. 60 quadrillion possible samples we could do. We did 20. Not very impressive, right? But if instead of this bias sample you did a random sample, totally random, then all these, thank you, as we move across, all these, if you were to go ahead and try to find the average of all these 60 quadrillion, it would be that. It's called the central limit theorem, folks. And that's crucial to us. So if we took all these averages we could get for all 60 quadrillion of size 10, and we took all of them and found the average of those x bars, it would be what we're trying to estimate mu. That's why we say this mean is an unbiased estimate of the population parameter. Boy, I just threw in the last 7 minutes a lot at you that you can't forget. This was a sample mean. This was a population mean. This is called a statistic, and this is called a parameter. So we have parameter and a statistic. A sample statistic, a population parameter. Here the alliteration. Sample, statistic, population, parameter. The sound of the P, the sound of the S. Okay. In addition to what you have to do for the lab, you should start reading in the text the first chapter. Okay. But I've covered, in overview in many respects, the entire course. Now, I'm going to come back to these numbers tomorrow, so make sure you've written these down for me. We're going to look at those with something that was done in the 1980s called Exploratory Data Analysis, EDA, by John Tukey. So that's where we're headed tomorrow. It's part of Chapter 1. So, Jennifer, I've run out of time, unfortunately, because I'd like to go another couple hours, but we don't have the time. So we're listening to